Thank you, Marike. Indeed, if we want to respond to drought with management, with planning, we can think about reactive measures, we can think about proactive measures. Proactive, how to solve it on long term. In fact, Victor Dries will talk about that later on in the session. And I will talk about the reactive measures that you can take against droughts, and I will do that with focus, of course, on Flanders. In fact, we worked on a plan for having reactive measures in place in the Flanders region of Belgium. And later on, as I said, Victor will talk about the Blue Deal. Blue Deal has the aim to minimize the risk of water scarcity, whereas the plan on which I will talk has the aim to have good solutions in case in real time a drought would happen or water scarcity conditions would happen. How can we minimize the risk that real water scarcity would happen? Or in case there is not sufficient water available for all the water users, how can we make priorities, or how can we choose between the different water users, different applications, and make difficult choices there? In fact, in the plan, we looked at two kinds of drought and water scarcity levels. The first level talks about imminent water scarcity. That means, if you look at the forecast, maybe within 2, 3, 4 weeks, water scarcity might happen, and it might be possible to take some anticipatory measures in order to try to limit the risk that this really would happen. And then the second drought level, or water scarcity level, where effective water scarcity would happens, in fact, and where we have to prioritize the water use. But of course, we should do that taking into account the socio-economic and ecological consequences of the drought. The plan was developed during a period of about 1 year, and we did that in close cooperation with all the stakeholders, more than 100 stakeholders involved, including the authorities, including the drinking water companies, the industrial sector, the agricultural sector, the nature sector, the shipping sector, the water and sewage companies, and some other councils and organizations as well. The plan has the following components. We started, first of all, to develop drought and water scarcity indicators. And as you can see, I made the distinction between drought indicators and water scarcity indicators. And there was a question about that for you, isn't it, before the break? That are the different drought and water scarcity indicators that we developed, or that we selected, I should say. Of course, some meteorological indicators which in real time, because there are indicators which are where follow-up will be done in real time, including the SPI, the SPEI, like we just have seen, also the rainfall deficit, and then some water scarcity indicators, some hydrological water scarcity indicators like the river flow, the river water levels, the soil moisture content, groundwater levels, like we have seen earlier in the session. And then also some water quality related water scarcity indicators, because it can also happen that water scarcity is not only related to the availability of water in the rivers, in the soil, but water scarcity can also be linked to the fact that the quality of the water is too bad for specific type of users or specific applications. And then we also look into some indicators related to the filling degree of reservoirs, storage reservoirs, or even rainwater tanks. In fact, for each of those indicators, we identified which are the water users related to those indicators, which were types of applications of water use related to it, and we also identified for every indicator 2 thresholds. Threshold number 1, if that level is reached, then you have imminent water scarcity. If threshold 2 is reached, then you have effective water scarcity. So what does that mean? That means that here there is a risk or a danger, let's say, that water scarcity might happen within, as I said, 2-3 weeks, depending on the forecast, and depending, of course, on the rainfall conditions in the next weeks. And effective water scarcity means that there is not sufficient water available for all the water users, all the applications. Secondly, we developed a water balance for the whole of Flanders, where we quantified the water availability along our surface waters in our phreatic groundwater bodies. Also looking at what all the types of water is available, like effluent water that could be used for certain applications, and also how much water is available in the storage reservoirs, including the rainwater tanks. In fact, this water availability, we can do a follow-up on that in real time, based on the one hand, real-time observations. We have the phreatic groundwater observations discussed before the break. Of course, we can also look at many other types of observations, like the river flows, the river water levels, and so on. And we complement those observations with the results of model simulations, which are also water balance models. On the other hand, we quantified the water use and or the water demand, because there's a small difference between water use and water demand. And here we make use of information about the permits, the charges, the reporting that has to be done to the government about emissions. We also make use of information on production data of drinking water, statistics on water consumption. We also developed, partly in the project, developed an irrigation demand model in such a way that we can also make an assessment of what is the demand for irrigation by farmers, and this in region-specific way, taking into account the ground conditions and taking into account the soil conditions. And we also made use of data on the traffic, the shipping traffic, because that's of course also quite important, because you know at locks, there's a lot of water that is going from one canal reach to another canal reach, and this of course should be taken into account as well, because it can also be a source of water shortages. Together with a sub-working group, we also identified or we defined ecological minimal flows for all the different rivers in Flanders, or almost all of them, in such a way that we also have an idea about when the flow goes lower than that threshold, then you will have consequences, negative consequences for the aquatic ecological life in the river. And we also have an urban hydrological model in such a way that we can also look into the rainwater availability. If we have an idea about the water availability in the different water bodies, if you have an idea about the water use, the water demand by the different users, and you also know for which type of water body we abstract, we can of course also compare the availability of water with the amount of water, and we can check whether we have a shortage, yes or no. Of course, the water balance calculation is done, is used for that, and this water balance calculation and water shortage quantification is done per sub-catchment, across Flanders, but also per river reach and per canal reach. And this calculation can be done in real time, such a way that we can follow it up, we can do a follow-up in real time. And in such a way that we can check in real time where do we have water shortages, how much, and which are the different water users affected by the water shortage. And this can be done and in forecasting mode, but also in real time. Of course, if we see that there is a risk of water shortage somewhere in the region, for some users, some catchments, or some rivers, some canals, and of course we can think about actions, measures we could take in order to try to limit the future of water scarcity, or to prioritize, as I said, the remaining water use. For that, we developed some impact indicators. What about the measures, the type of actions we could take? Well, in fact, there are two kinds of actions we can take. On the one hand, you have actions where we can extend the water supply, or in fact try to make more water available. I'll give you an example. You can, for instance, put some pumps in such a way that at blocks, where water gets lost from one canal reach to another one, that water is pumped back. This is an example of action you could take with a pumping station where in fact the water will be brought from a place where there is too much water available to a place where there is a water shortage. Or you can, with adjustment of hydraulic structure regulations, do some changes. But you can also switch to other water sources or create additional water sources. One example is, for instance, effluent discharges from treatment plants. You can allow, for instance, farmers to make use of that. And then farmers can, in fact, have an additional water source. Or you can, for instance, make groundwater that is pumped up at construction sites, building construction sites, make that available, situated, and this water can be used. Other types of actions you could take are related to trying to reduce the water use, the water abstraction. Along the locks, you can think about grouping ships, such that you reduce the amount of water that gets lost there. You can call it lost from one reach to another reach. You can put some draft restrictions, or you can put a complete ban on shipping. It's of course a very strict measure here. And of course, this will only be taken if this is really, really needed. Huh? If, let's say, the drought situation is very extreme. You can take some measures where you limit the amount of abstraction for one or more types of water consumers. This can be, think about companies, you can think about households, you can think about factory water companies, agricultural sector. You can also think about limiting the amount of water that is put in nature reserves, and of course you can also limit the recreation. For farmers, you can put a limitation on abstraction of water, but you can also put a limitation on irrigation. And then of course for the different types of water uses and the different one or more water bodies, depending on, of course, where the water shortage is exactly, which type of water bodies, or in okay. On the other hand, there are also some measures, some actions related to water quality. So if you have water quality problems, then it can be that there is, as I said, sufficient water available in terms of water quantity, maybe not in terms of water quality for certain applications. So then we think about, let's say, actions where we put a ban on water abstraction for certain types of applications which need good quality water. Quality water is higher than what is in fact in real time measured or forecasted. You can also think about, let's say, recommendations. You can also think about recreation, a ban on water recreation. You can think about, this is more for the sea logs, the stop reverse discharge management. You can think about, as an example, of the zeeschelde, stop dredging, and you can also think about the ban on groundwater intake in the zones where we have groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems, or the places where groundwater levels become so low that there is a severe impact on those ecosystems. The idea is that the measures will be taken region depending, or sub-region depending. So that means, or sub-region specific I should say. So what we did was, for different basin, we looked at the different indicators, the water balance, the different types of measures we could take, and we did already some calculations to show that framework works. And we did that by testing the framework to a number of events, like the flood event of July 2018. We applied the framework and we checked what is the impact of different types of measures, and we tested in fact whether the framework works in a proper way. And this application was evaluated by the different stakeholders presented in one of the first slides. But the measures can be taken at the level of a river basin, but can also be taken at the level of a sub-basin. As I said, the water balance is calculated in real time for sub-basin. So it is up to, let's say, the authorities who are responsible, in fact, for taking the measures to decide where exactly to take the measures, and they can rely on the quantifications we do for them. So objective information they can use in order to come up with the decision making at the end. What about now the impact of the measures? So if you want to know what is now, how effective is a given type of measure, what is the specific impact of that? Well, then of course we have on the one hand the positive impact on reducing the water shortage, and that's the main aim of course of the measure. We calculate that using the water balance. But we also look at not only this impact on water shortage, but also on, let's say, the reduced consequences, because if you have reduced water shortage, you also have less consequences of this water shortage. And here we quantified and the economic consequences, the social consequences, and the ecological consequences. How we did, I don't have time to explain that. It will be part of 500 pages, you can take a copy and read. For instance, by looking at the company turnover value, looking at the higher cost if a company has to switch from, for instance, surface water to tap water and drinking water. Social consequences, you may think about the company employment. Ecological consequences, you can think about loss of ecosystem services, the reintroduction cost of fish, the fish will die, and things like that. And then we also looked at the cost of each of the measures, in such a way that we then could do a cost-benefit evaluation and prioritize the measures, of course, only measures which have a positive benefit compared to the cost are meaningful to take. And if you have to prioritize, of course, the measure with the highest priority is the one that has the highest benefit. So far, in those quantifications, especially the economic one here, we looked mainly at the direct and the local costs, and for the cost of the measure, and for the consequences, which I call here the damage and the consequences more in general, we looked only at the short-term consequences. But later on, the authorities had a plan to further extend that in such a way that also the indirect costs and the non-local costs and the longer-term damages will be taken into account as well. There is a dashboard developed. Jan already presented the dashboard very quickly for indicators. He has shown the page on the groundwater indicator, but in fact the dashboard is also available for all the other indicators. And there is a second dashboard that is not ready yet. We are still working on that. And it should be finalized in a follow-up project, but the idea is basically that we have here a dashboard where all the information I presented will be summarized in a compact way, in such a way that authorities can, let's say, make use of that information in the decision making, because finally it is up to the provincial governors, the mayors of the municipalities and the cities, and the water authorities, and if it becomes very extreme, even the minister, to take actions to decide about the measures. What we have developed is a framework that provides support in the decision-making process, objective facts and figures that the decision makers can make use of in such a way that the decisions could be made in case of water shortages, in case of extreme droughts. Take into account that it is region-specific, water body-specific measures that can be taken, priorities which are calculated. The work is not finished. There's still several extensions, refinements that we could make. We have put some recommendations here. So it means that also on the longer term, further refinements will be made. All right, that's for me. Thank you.